Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. On December 26th, 10 years before Custer's last stand, 81 American soldiers rode over a snow-covered ridge in northern Wyoming and vanished. Not one came back. Within 40 minutes, every single man was dead and almost none of them were killed by bullets. That last detail is the one that should stop you cold. 81 soldiers, armed with rifles, riding in formation under the command of trained officers, wiped out in less time than it takes to walk a mile. And when the Army recovered the bodies, the surgeons found that only 6 men had died from gunshot wounds. 6 out of 81. The rest were killed at arm's length by weapons most Americans considered primitive. This was the United States Army's worst defeat on the Great Plains. Not Little Bighorn, but a battle most people have never heard of. A battle where a captain who boasted he could ride through the entire Sioux Nation with men got exactly 80 men and rode to his death. The Fetterman Fight didn't just kill 81 men. It shattered the myth of American military invincibility on the frontier. It forced a nation to confront the possibility that its westward expansion could be stopped, not by terrain, not by weather, but by a coalition of warriors executing a plan of devastating precision. Here at Crimson Legacy Historians, we dig into the battles they never put in the textbooks. And by the end of this video, you'll understand how a young warrior named Crazy Horse helped engineer one of the most perfectly executed ambushes in American military history, and how a prophecy made days earlier predicted the exact death toll. You'll understand how men who carried captured firearms and war clubs and lances designed a trap intended not to wound, not to rout, but to annihilate. And you'll understand why the manner of Fetterman's death remains disputed to this day, whether he fell by his own hand or by the blade of a warrior named American Horse. So how does a trained military officer, explicitly ordered not to cross that ridge, end up dead on the other side of it? To understand how 81 men marched into oblivion, you need to understand what brought them to that frozen ridge in the first place. The year was 1866, and the United States was barely 12 months past the end of the Civil War. The nation's gaze had turned westward with a hunger that bordered on religious conviction. Gold had been discovered in Montana Territory, and the fastest route to the gold field cut directly through the Powder River country, the last great hunting grounds of the Lakota Sioux, the northern Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. The road was called the Bozeman Trail, and it carved through the heart of treaty-protected land. The 1651 Fort Laramie Treaty had guaranteed this territory to the Lakota. The government's decision to build military forts along the trail wasn't just an act of expansion. It was a direct violation of its own treaty, and everyone knew it. The Lakota leader, Red Cloud, refused to negotiate when the Army began construction of forts along the trail. He organized a sustained campaign of raids, ambushes, and harassment against every soldier and wagon that moved through his territory. This was not sporadic resistance. This was organized warfare, coordinated across bands and seasons, designed to make the Bozeman Trail so costly that the United States would abandon it entirely. And the warriors who gathered that winter carried more than weapons. They carried memory. In 1864, Colorado militia had attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment at Sand Creek, killing more than 50 people, mostly women, children, and the elderly. The militia mutilated the dead and paraded trophies through Denver. Sand Creek was not a battle, it was a massacre, and it galvanized the tribes of the northern plains into a fury that no treaty council could extinguish. The warriors preparing to fight near Fort Phil Kearny that December carried Sand Creek like a scar, a wound that demanded an answer. Fort Phil Kearny itself was a wooden stockade in present-day northern Wyoming built in the summer of 1860. It sat in a landscape of timber-rich hills that offered concealment to attackers on every side. In fact, its commander understood better than anyone. Colonel Henry B. Carrington was an engineer by training, not a combat officer. He had designed the fort with precision and care, but he had never led men in a pitched battle against an enemy like this. His caution was born not of cowardice, but of self-awareness. He knew what he didn't know. The garrison, under his command, lived in a state of perpetual siege. Wood-cutting details sent to harvest timber for the fort were attacked almost daily. Soldiers couldn't leave the stockade walls without risking ambush. The fort felt less like a stronghold and more like a target painted on the Wyoming grassland. Into this pressure arrived Captain William J. Fetterman. He was a Civil War veteran recently posted to the frontier, and he burned with contempt for the warriors who harassed the fort. Fetterman had fought Confederates in some of the war's bloodiest engagements, and he carried the certainty of a man who believed that experience translated across all battlefields. He allegedly boasted, and this is the statement that will follow him into history and into the grave: "Give me 80 men and I'll ride through the whole Sioux Nation." Fetterman represented every officer who believed that the lessons of Cheyenne and Chickamauga applied to the Powder River country. They did not. But Fetterman wasn't the only one making plans that December. Miles from the fort, in camps hidden among the frozen creek bottoms, more than 1,000 warriors were preparing something the United States Army had never faced on the plains. A coordinated multi-tribal ambush designed to annihilate. The coalition that gathered in the days before the battle was unlike anything the Frontier Army had encountered. Lakota warriors from the Oglala and Minneconjou bands, Northern Cheyenne, Arapaho. These were not scattered raiding parties operating on impulse. This was a deliberate military alliance organized under the broader strategic framework of Red Cloud's War, and it numbered more than 1,000 fighting men. Consider that scale. 1,000 warriors from multiple tribes, speaking different languages, following different spiritual traditions, yet operating under a single tactical plan with disciplined coordination. Nothing like this had been assembled on the northern plains in living memory. The plan was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its ambition. A small group of warriors, roughly 10 men, would ride toward the fort and provoke the soldiers. They would attack the wood train or taunt the garrison directly. When the soldiers rode out in pursuit, the decoys would feign weakness. They would retreat slowly, always staying just beyond effective rifle range, always appearing vulnerable enough to chase. They would draw the soldiers north, up and over Lodge Trail Ridge. And on the far side of that ridge, hidden in ravines and behind boulders and lying flat in the frozen grass, the main force of more than 1,000 warriors would be waiting. Before the battle, a Cheyenne medicine man named Crazy Mule performed a ceremony that would echo through history. He prophesied that exactly 100 soldiers would be killed, taken by the hands of the warriors. The coming fight was given a name, the Battle of the 100 in the Hands. This was not mere superstition to the men who heard it. Crazy Mule's prophecy electrified the coalition. Warriors rode into their concealed positions carrying not just weapons, but spiritual certainty. They believed the outcome had already been decided by powers greater than tactics. Among the decoys chosen for the most dangerous role was a young Oglala Lakota warrior named Crazy Horse. He was not yet the legendary figure he would become at the Little Bighorn a decade later. But he was already recognized for extraordinary courage and a tactical instinct that older warriors respected. Crazy Horse was chosen because the decoy role demanded a specific and terrifying kind of nerve. He would ride close enough to 80 armed soldiers to draw their fire. He would absorb their volleys, wheel his horse, retreat just fast enough to keep them chasing, never so fast that they gave up the pursuit. Think about what that required. The decoys had to ride within rifle range of 18 armed soldiers, appear to be losing and make it look convincing. One horse stumbling at the wrong moment. One warrior falling from a saddle, one decoy riding too fast or too slow. Any single mistake and the entire ambush collapses. The soldiers turn back. The 1,000 warriors hidden beyond the ridge wait for nothing. Everything depended on 10 men riding the razor's edge between provocation and death. The soldiers inside Fort Phil Kearny carried Springfield muzzle-loading rifles, single-shot weapons that required a complex reloading process after every discharge. In the freezing December temperatures, fingers went numb within minutes. Fumbling with paper cartridges, ramrods and percussion caps in sub-zero cold turned every reload into an ordeal. Some of the cavalry carried Spencer repeating carbines with 7-shot capacity, but ammunition was limited, and the tubes that fed the Spencers ran dry fast. The warriors, by contrast, carried bows capable of loosing 10 to 20 arrows per minute, a rate of fire that dwarfed anything a muzzleloader could produce. War clubs with stone or bone heads, lances tipped with iron or sharpened bone, knives. Some warriors carried captured or traded firearms, but the majority relied on weapons perfected over generations for exactly the kind of fighting they intended: close range, fast, and overwhelming. The warriors' entire tactical design was built around closing distance. Once the gap between the two forces shrank to arm's length, the soldiers' rifles became nothing more than clumsy clubs. The warriors' weapons were designed for precisely that range. Lodge Trail Ridge ran roughly north from Fort Phil Kearny, a long spine of grass-covered terrain that served as the dividing line between survival and annihilation. On the fort side of the ridge, there was visibility. There was the possibility of reinforcement, of artillery support, of retreat to the stockade. On the far side, the ground dropped away into a maze of ravines, boulder fields, and frozen creek bottoms, terrain that could swallow 1,000 men and leave no trace of them, visible from the ridge line. The December landscape was brutal. Snow covered the ground. Temperatures hung well below freezing. Breath crystallized in the air. The cold would slow soldiers' hands, stiffen leather, make metal barrels painful to grip with bare skin. By the morning of December 20th, 1866, every piece was in position. The decoys knew their routes. The warriors lay hidden in the ravines, wrapped in buffalo robes against the cold, their weapons beside them. And inside Fort Phil Kearny, a wood train was about to come under attack again. The morning is bitterly cold. Frost coats every surface inside the stockade. The wood train, soldiers and wagons sent to cut timber in the hills west of the fort, departs through the gates, as it does almost every day, grinding across frozen ground toward the tree line. And as happens almost every day, warriors appear and attack it. The sounds of gunfire carry back to the fort on the still winter air. Carrington must send a relief force. The wood train cannot be abandoned. He selects Captain Fetterman to lead it. What follows is one of the most consequential exchanges in American frontier history. Colonel Carrington gives Fetterman explicit, unambiguous instructions. Relieve the wood train, drive off the attackers, and return to the fort. Under no circumstances is Fetterman to pursue the enemy beyond Lodge Trail Ridge. Do not cross the ridge. Do not go out of sight of the fort. Carrington is so concerned about Fetterman's temperament, the man's reckless aggression, his open contempt for the warriors, that he reportedly sends a second messenger to repeat the order after Fetterman has already departed. This is not a suggestion from a timid bureaucrat. This is a direct command from a commanding officer who understands the tactical reality that his subordinate refuses to accept. Fetterman's force assembles inside the stockade. Infantry and cavalry. Approximately 80 to 81 men total, including 2 civilians, experienced frontiersmen who volunteered to join the column. Horses stamp against the cold. Breath rises from the formation in clouds. Men check their weapons, tighten cinches, pull gloves over stiffening fingers. The gates open. Fetterman leads his command out of Fort Phil Kearny and into the frozen landscape. He rides toward the wood train, but before he reaches it, the decoys appear. They materialize on the slopes near the base of Lodge Trail Ridge. A small group of warriors, perhaps 10, riding with what appears to be reckless abandon. They taunt the soldiers. They ride close enough to loose an arrow or wave a weapon, then wheel away in apparent disarray. They look exactly like what Fetterman expects to see. A handful of impudent raiders who could be scattered by a single determined charge. Fetterman takes the bait. Instead of continuing toward the wood train, his actual mission, his direct order, he turns his entire force toward the decoys. The pursuit begins. The decoys retreat slowly, always staying just beyond effective rifle range. When the soldiers slow their advance, the decoys slow. When the soldiers press harder, the decoys accelerate just enough to stay ahead, never enough to break contact. It is a masterpiece of controlled provocation, and Crazy Horse is at the heart of it, riding within killing distance of 80 armed men and making it look effortless. The column climbs the rising ground toward Lodge Trail Ridge. Behind them, the fort is still visible, a dark rectangle of timber against the white landscape. The wood train, now entirely forgotten, sits to the southwest. Fetterman's entire focus has narrowed to the warriors dancing just out of reach. This is where the story tips from reckless to fatal. The decoys crest Lodge Trail Ridge and vanish down the far slope. Fetterman follows. The moment his column crosses the ridgeline, they lose sight of Fort Phil Kearny. They have violated Carrington's direct order. They are now in terrain they do not control, pursuing an enemy they do not understand, moving deeper into ground that conceals a force they cannot see and cannot imagine. From the top of the ridge, the soldiers see the terrain dropping away into broken ground. Rains cutting through the hillside, scattered boulders, frozen grass flattened by wind and snow. The decoys are still visible below, still retreating, still appearing to be a small and manageable problem. What the soldiers do not see is the ambush array on both sides of the descending trail. More than 1,000 warriors lie motionless in the ravines and behind the rocks, forming a massive crescent, open at the top where the soldiers enter, curving close behind them as they descend. From the warriors' positions, they can hear the horses. They can feel the column's vibration through the frozen earth. Every muscle is tensed. Every hand grips a weapon. Discipline holds. Fetterman had been given 80 men, almost exactly the number he once said he'd need to ride through the entire Sioux Nation. He was about to discover how wrong he was. The decoys scatter. In the same heartbeat, the world erupts. Warriors rise from concealment on every side. From the ravines, from behind boulders, from the frozen grass where they have lain motionless in the killing cold. The war cry has hit the column like a wall of sound. Hundreds of voices at once, a roar that echoes off the frozen terrain and fills every direction. There is nowhere to turn that the sound does not come from. The soldiers' advance stops dead. Officers shout orders that dissolve in the chaos. Horses rear and plunge against their bits. Men scramble to identify the threat, but the threat is everywhere. Then the arrows begin to fall. In the next 40 minutes, every man in Fetterman's command would be dead. And the way they died would haunt the United States Army for a generation. The ambush force attacks from 3 sides simultaneously. The crescent of warriors closes behind the column, sealing the road of retreat back over the ridge. The soldiers are inside a kill zone with no exit, and almost immediately the column fractures. The infantry on foot, burdened by heavy coats and ammunition, cannot keep pace with the mounted cavalry. Within minutes, a gap opens between the two groups. The infantry clusters on the slope. The cavalry pulls north. This separation is the death stroke. A force that might have held together, might have formed a perimeter, might have bought time for reinforcement, is now to isolated clusters, each too small to withstand what is bearing down on them. The warriors do not charge in a single mass. They attack in waves, small groups of fighters darting in from different angles, loosing arrows at close range, wheeling away before the soldiers can form a coherent volley, replaced instantly by the next group pressing from the opposite direction. The effect is relentless, rotating pressure from every point of the compass. The soldiers cannot establish a firing line because there is no single direction to face. War cries, the hiss of arrows cutting frozen air, the crack of the few firearms warriors carry. Horses screaming as shafts strike their flanks. And underneath it all, the terrible mathematics of reloading a Springfield muzzleloader requires. Tearing a paper cartridge with your teeth, pouring the powder charge, seating the bowl with a ramrod, fitting a percussion cap onto the nipple, 15 to 20 seconds under ideal conditions, in sub-zero cold with fingers that have lost all feeling, with warriors closing from every direction and arrows falling like sleet. Some soldiers never get a second shot off. Fetterman and his infantry, roughly 50 men, scramble toward a cluster of large boulders on the slope. They are fighting for a defensive position, any position, some scrap of terrain that might slow the tide. Fetterman, whatever his failings as a tactician, does not panic. He gets his men into the rocks. But the rocks are not a fortress. They are a cluster of waist-high boulders on an exposed hillside. They offer something to crouch behind, but arrows arc over them in parabolic volleys, dropping nearly vertical into the huddled men. Warriors crawl close through dead ground the soldiers cannot cover. Approaching from angles that the boulder cluster's geometry leaves exposed. Crazy Horse, his role as decoy now complete, joins the main assault. The young warrior who minutes ago rode alone within rifle range of the entire column now fights among the full weight of the coalition. Here is what makes this battle different from almost any other engagement in the Indian Wars. The warriors are not trying to drive the soldiers away. They are not raiding. They are not harassing. They are trying to kill every single one of them. A trap designed not to wound, not to rout, but to annihilate. The fighting among the boulders becomes close quarters killing. The defensive circle shrinks as men fall, each death compressing the survivors into a tighter ring. The warriors tighten with them, using the broken terrain to approach from angles the dwindling number of soldiers cannot cover. Arrows come in volleys that darken the air above the rocks. A trained warrior can release a shaft every 3 to 4 seconds. Multiply that rate by hundreds of bowmen concentrating their fire on a cluster of boulders no larger than a modest room. Soldiers who raise their heads to aim are struck before they can fire. Soldiers who keep their heads down cannot engage the enemy at all. Then the warrior is close to arm's length, and the nature of the fighting changes utterly. War clubs crash through felt campaign hats and shatter the skulls beneath. Lances drive through heavy wool coats and the flesh underneath. The soldiers fight back with everything they have. Rifle butts swung like bludgeons, bayonets thrust at point-blank range, belt knives drawn for the first and last time. But at every point of contact, they are numbered 20 to 1. Individual courage cannot overcome those odds. Individual skill cannot overcome those odds. Nothing can overcome those odds. Captain William J. Fetterman dies among the rocks. The manner of his death is disputed to this day. The Army's official autopsy report records a powder-burned throat wound, evidence consistent with a gunshot fired at close contact. Some accounts from the soldier's side suggest that Fetterman and Captain Frederick Brown placed their revolvers to each other's temples and fired simultaneously, choosing death on their own terms rather than capture. But Lakota oral history tells a different account. A warrior named American Horse fought his way through the chaos of the rock position and reached Fetterman, closing the distance to knife range. American Horse's blade opened Fetterman's throat. Whether by his own hand or by American Horse's edge, the men who boasted about riding through the Sioux Nation died surrounded by it. In a circle of boulders he never should have been behind. On the wrong side of a ridge he'd been ordered never to cross. Approximately 20 minutes after the ambush springs, the fighting among the rocks falls silent. Fetterman and roughly 49 of his men are dead. Not wounded, not captured, dead. The warriors do not take prisoners on this day. The bodies will later be found in a tight circle, shoulder to shoulder, facing outward. They fought back to back until the last man fell. The geometry of their death told the story. For the warriors, this is not massacre. This is battle. They have lost men too. The fighting in the rocks is ferocious at close quarters, and warriors fall to bayonet thrusts and point-blank rifle fire. But the outcome was decided the moment the column crossed the ridge. What remains is the grim arithmetic of the final reckoning. The smell of black powder and blood hangs in the frozen air, sharp and metallic. The sound of war clubs striking yielding surfaces, and then silence over the rocks, a silence that lasts only a moment before the war cries turn north. But the battle is only half over. 400 yards to the north, the cavalry is still alive, and they are about to face the full weight of 1,000 warriors, with nothing between them but open ground. When the ambush sprang, the cavalry, mounted and faster than the infantry, had bolted north along the ridge, opening a 400-yard gap between themselves and Fetterman's foot soldiers. Whether this was a deliberate attempt to break through the encirclement or a panicked flight remains debated by historians. The result is identical. Roughly 30 cavalrymen now find themselves on a flat, exposed section of ridgetop with no cover whatsoever. No boulders, no trees, no ravines to shelter in. Just frozen grass and wind-packed snow stretching in every direction. They dismount. Standard Army doctrine dictates that every fourth man holds the horses while the rest form a firing line. But a firing line requires a defined front to face, and the warriors are coming from everywhere. The cavalry carries Spencer repeating carbines, 7-shot weapons that can fire as fast as a man can work the lever. For a brief, desperate window, the rapid fire creates a zone of destruction around the perimeter that keeps the closest warriors at bay. Spent brass cases arc into the snow, steaming. The Spencers bark in steady rhythm. But Spencer ammunition comes in preloaded tubes, and the troopers carry a finite supply. When the tubes run empty, the rate of fire drops to single-shot speed, then to nothing, and the warriors who have watched and waited and counted the volleys know exactly when the firing slows. With the infantry dead, the entire coalition pivots north. 1,000 warriors converge on 30 men standing in the open with dwindling ammunition and nowhere to run. Lieutenant George W. Grumman draws his saber. It is almost an anachronism, a weapon from an earlier century of warfare, already fading from relevance. But Grumman uses it. When warriors breach the disintegrating firing line, he swings the heavy blade with the desperate strength of a man who knows he is going to die and intends to take someone with him. He strikes down at least one warrior who closes within reach, a blow of savage and futile courage. It changes nothing. The warriors pour through the gaps from every direction. Grumman is dragged from his feet and killed. The final minutes are hand-to-hand across the entire position, lances and war clubs against men who have fired their last cartridges. Some soldiers swing empty rifles like clubs. Some pull belt knives, some simply stand amid the onslaught and are overwhelmed where they stand. Horses scream and break free of their handlers, stampeding through the tangled fighters, hooves pounding the frozen ground in a vibration felt through every man's boots. 20 minutes. That is how long the cavalry lasts after the infantry falls. 20 minutes of a shrinking circle on open ground, the perimeter collapsing inward with each man who drops, until the circle is too small to hold, and the last trooper is killed. Not a single man from Fetterman's command survives. Not one. 0 survivors. No ambiguity, no excuses. A force of warriors carrying bows and war clubs and lances had annihilated an entire command of the United States Army in less time than it takes to eat lunch. The era of American invincibility on the frontier ended on a frozen Wyoming ridge. Back at Fort Phil Kearny, Carrington has heard the gunfire. He has heard the volume of war cries carrying on the frozen wind. The sound too large for a skirmish, too sustained for a raid, and then the sound stopped. The silence is worse. Carrington dispatches a relief column under Captain 10 under 10 Ike, who leads his men up toward the ridge as fast as the terrain and the cold allow. 10 Ike's column crests Lodge Trail Ridge and sees nothing. No soldiers in formation. No organized retreat. The battlefield stretches before them in terrible stillness. Then they begin to find the bodies. The dead lie scattered across 2 positions, the rocks where the infantry made their stand, and the flat ground 400 yards north where the cavalry perished. Every body has been stripped bare. Every body bears the evidence of what was done after death, acts that in the warrior's tradition carry spiritual purpose and serve as retribution for a coalition carrying the memory of Sand Creek, where their own women and children had suffered identical desecration at the hands of Colorado militia. There's a grim and deliberate symmetry in what they have done here. The infantry dead are found in their tight circle among the boulders, still in the formation they held at the end. The cavalry dead are spread across the open ground, tangled with fallen horses in the positions where they dropped. In the sub-zero cold, blood has frozen where it spilled. The expressions on the dead men's faces are preserved by the frost, contorted, rigid, staring at a sky they can no longer see. 10 X-men are shaken to their foundation. Several are veterans of the Civil War, men who survived Antietam, Gettysburg, the Wilderness. Men who believed they had seen the worst that war could produce. They will later say, some of them in writing, that the Fetterman battlefield was the worst thing they ever witnessed. The silence of the battlefield presses against the living like a physical weight. The wind moves across the ridge. Frozen grass crunches underfoot. The absence of human sound where an hour before 81 men were still breathing. That absence is louder than the gunfire ever was. Carrington now knows the full scope of the catastrophe. The officer he sent out with direct, repeated orders has disobeyed those orders, crossed the ridge, and lost every man under his command. Inside the fort, Carrington orders every remaining man to arms. Women and children are moved into the powder magazine, the fort's ammunition storehouse, and Carrington issues an order that freezes the blood. If the fort is overrun, the magazine is to be detonated. He would rather destroy his own people in a single blast than allow them to be taken. That is the measure of the fear that now grips Fort Phil Kearny. Carrington needs to send word to the outside world, but the nearest telegraph is at Fort Laramie, due 76 miles to the south through territory controlled by the same warriors who just destroyed Fetterman's command. A civilian scout named John Phillips, known as Portuguese Phillips, volunteers to make the ride. He departs the fort under cover of darkness in the teeth of a blizzard. Mounted on Carrington's own thoroughbred horse, he will ride for 4 days through sub-zero temperatures and hostile territory. arriving at Fort Laramie on Christmas night, staggering through the doors of an officer's holiday ball frostbitten and barely conscious, and delivering the news that changes everything. The full toll, when it is finally tabulated, reads like this: 81 dead, 76 enlisted men, 3 officers, Fetterman, Brown, and Drummond, 2 civilians who volunteered to ride along, every single one killed. And the autopsy details confirm what the opening of this story promised. Only 6 of the 81 died from gunshot wounds. 75 men were killed by arrows, war clubs, lances, and knives. That statistic tells you everything about the nature of the engagement. The warriors closed the distance. They fought at arm's length. They overwhelmed the soldiers with weapons forged for exactly this kind of combat. Native casualties remain uncertain, as is typical for engagements of this era. Estimates range from as few as 10 to more than 60 killed, with many more wounded. The warriors recovered their own dead, a practice that makes precise counting impossible for historians. Whether Fetterman fell by his own hand or by American horse's blade, the official record says throat wound, and the Lakota oral history says American horse. Either way, the man who boasted about 18 men died with exactly that number around him. 3 lives in the aftermath tell the story of what this battle cost. Lieutenant Drummond's wife, Frances, was inside the fort when the column returned, not with living men, but with wagons. She was pregnant with their first child. She would later write a memoir describing the moment she learned her husband was dead. The sound of the ambulance wagons creaking through the gates, the wailing of other wives rising from the quarters, the sight of frozen remains being carried past her like cargo. Her account endures as one of the most vivid and devastating primary sources of the disaster. Colonel Carrington was relieved of command within weeks. The Army needed a scapegoat, and the man who had given the correct order, the order that was disobeyed, became the one who was punished. Carrington would spend the remaining decades of his life arguing, correctly, that Fetterman's insubordination caused the catastrophe, not his own leadership. History would eventually vindicate him, but not in his lifetime. He carried the stain of the Fetterman fight to his grave. Among the Lakota and Cheyenne, the returning warriors were received as victors who had fulfilled a vision. Crazy Mule's prophecy, the 100 in the hands, was affirmed. The actual count of 81 was close enough to the prophesied 100 that the spiritual authority of the medicine man's vision remained unquestioned, a prophecy written in blood and confirmed by mathematics. The news Phillips carried reached the telegraph and raced east. Newspapers seized on the story with the kind of horrified fascination that only total defeat produces. An entire command annihilated, wiped out to the last man. The political shockwave was immediate. Congress erupted in debate over frontier policy. Generals argued over whether to launch punitive expeditions or pull back from the trail entirely. Hawks demanded more troops and larger campaigns. Doves argued that the forts were indefensible and should be abandoned before more soldiers died. The Fetterman disaster became ammunition for both sides of a debate that would define the next decade of American expansion. But the battle's end was just the beginning. The Fetterman fight set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the American frontier for a generation. Red Cloud's War continued through 1867 and into 1868, with the Fetterman disaster serving as its most powerful argument. The fight had proven in the starkest possible terms that the Bozeman Trail forts were untenable, that soldiers stationed along the route were not projecting American power but offering themselves as targets. In 1868, the United States government sued for peace. The resulting Treaty of Fort Laramie granted the Lakota ownership of the Black Hills and the Powder River country and, crucially, required the Army to abandon the Bozeman Trail forts entirely. Fort Phil Kearny was evacuated. As the last soldiers marched out through the gates, Lakota warriors rode in and burned the stockade to the ground. Red Cloud's War stands as one of the only conflicts in American history in which a native nation fought the United States to a standstill and won territorial concessions through military force confirmed by treaty. But the victory carried within it the seed of its own undoing. Within a decade, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills shattered the 1868 treaty as completely as the Bozeman Trail had shattered the treaty before it. The Great Sioux War of 1876 followed, and at the Little Bighorn in June of that year, another overconfident officer, George Armstrong Custer, led another command to annihilation against Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, including an older, battle-hardened Crazy Horse. The parallels between the two disasters are devastating. A commander who underestimated his enemy, an order to exercise caution that was ignored, a force divided and overwhelmed in detail. Those 40 minutes on the frozen ridge had already written the lesson. The Army simply refused to read it. For more than a century, the Fetterman fight was told almost exclusively from the American military perspective, a tale of one officer's arrogance and another's incompetence. The other side of the story, the months of planning, the coalition building across tribal lines, the spiritual preparation, the tactical brilliance of the decoy strategy, was treated as footnote rather than narrative. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, the Battle of the 100 in the Hands is remembered as a triumph of coordination, spiritual power, and tactical genius. It is the story of a people defending their homeland against an invading army, a narrative largely absent from American textbooks for over a century. Modern archaeology at the battle site has confirmed much of the native oral history. The positions of the remains match the accounts passed down through generations. The distribution of arrowheads and fragments of close combat weapons across the site confirms what the warriors always said. This battle was won at arm's length. 81 men rode over edge and disappeared in 14 minutes. Almost none were killed by bullets. Now you understand not just what happened, but why. A boastful officer who disobeyed a direct order. A coalition of warriors executing a plan of lethal precision. A prophecy that, depending on how you count, came true. The Fetterman Fight was the battle that proved the frontier could fight back. And it fought back with devastating precision. 10 years before Little Bighorn, the lesson was already written in blood on a frozen Wyoming ridge. The Army simply refused to read it. If this story gripped you, you're in the right place. Crimson Legacy Historians covers the battles and turning points they left out of the textbooks, because those are always the ones worth knowing. Subscribe so you never miss one.